Well, the fact is, around employment and jobs, no energy technology employs more people at better wages than nuclear energy does. When you build a nuclear power plant, you need over 2,500 people on the site for a 4-year period building the plant of all different skill levels. And then when you operate that nuclear plant, you need between 400 and 700 people working 3 shifts to run the plant, far more than are employed in natural gas or coal-fired plants or even in any of the renewables. There's more people involved at higher levels of skill with better wages in nuclear. So a nuclear power plant is basically a very compact, very powerful wealth-creating machine in a community. And that machine continues to produce wealth at the tune of about $500 million a year for 60 or 80 years once it's built. They're very expensive to build, nuclear plants. They're the most expensive. Like, it's much cheaper to build a gas plant than it is to build a nuclear plant. But then you got to buy gas for the next 20, 30 years. Whereas with nuclear, the fuel cost is a very small portion of the total cost of operating a nuclear plant, which means they are not as susceptible to fluctuations in fuel price as fossil fuel plants. And they employ a lot more people for a longer period of time than any other technology. So it's kind of like comparing a normal incandescent light bulb, which you can get for 50 cents, but it's only going to last a year, and it's going to use a lot of energy. Whereas if you put in a compact fluorescent bulb, you might have to pay $3 or $4 for it, but it's going to last 5 times as long. And when it's running, when it's burning, it only uses 1/4 as much power. So nuclear is kind of like that. It's a high cost up front, but then a very low operating cost for a long lifespan. And so they pay back into their community over and over again during the course of their lives, all the while producing clean energy that is not polluting the air. If you go to a nuclear plant anywhere in the United States, and there's, as I say, there's 104 of them operating around the country, it's almost like a nature reserve around most of these plants. They generally tend to have a fairly good chunk of land so that they're buffered from population. And that land is usually basically a nature reserve. Beautiful forests and streams and lakes with lots of wildlife and no pollution. So there's a saying, the closer you get to a nuclear plant, the better the roads and schools are, because they pay a lot of taxes. And the people who work in them pay a lot of taxes and are productive members of their community, contributing from an economic point of view. So in terms of job creation, there is no better way to create jobs in a community than to build nuclear power to provide the energy for the future. The United States is in a particularly unique situation in that most of the large energy infrastructure is privately owned here by utilities, private utilities. Whereas in most countries, the electricity generating technology is state-owned. Even Canada, right next door, all the nuclear plants in Canada, there's 18 of them, are owned by the governments of the various provinces. In Russia, in China, in Korea, the nuclear plants are owned by the government. And so when the government wants to build a new nuclear plant, it just builds it. Here, we expect private capital to make the decision about what kind of power plant to build and whether to build it or not. So that means that all the risk of building a power plant is with the private capital. And the challenge in the United States is to create a sharing of the financial risk that's taken when you invest $8 billion in a new nuclear plant. The ratepayers have to take some of that risk. The government has to take some of that risk. In other words, the voters, the people, the public. And the financial institutions have to take some of that risk. And the utility has to take some of it. Structuring a risk-sharing formula where it isn't just one utility that's taking all the risk for an $8 billion investment, because their attitude is just as likely to be, why not build a bunch of gas plants? They're way cheaper to build, they're quicker, there's less political risk involved, especially now with these first new nuclear plants coming on, the first in 30 years, it's kind of unknown territory from the point of view of the political and culture, the social aspect of it, as to whether it's going to be accepted in the community. Are there going to be lawsuits coming out of the blue? Because they can't afford to have these. When you start building an $8 billion plant, you can't afford to have it stop for a year for some reason. That's the kind of risk that people are thinking about. Hopefully none of that will happen, and it will all go smoothly, and then people will realize that there isn't so much risk, and then it'll be easier to continue financing the 4th and 5th and 6th nuclear plant. Right now, we do have 4 nuclear plants approved, brand new ones, in Georgia and in South Carolina. So we've made the first big hurdle, and those plants are under construction now as we speak. So we're going to see the outcome of that. Hopefully, we'll be on time, on budget, and producing thousands of megawatts of new clean power within a few years from now. So that's a very good situation that we've arrived at. It's taken a long time for that to come about, and a lot of work by a lot of people. I think once that model is seen to be workable, then the perception of risk will go down. But it is more difficult in the United States because of the fact that the infrastructure is privately owned. Whereas in a country like France, they decide they need a new power plant, they build a new power plant. And actually, in those countries, the taxpayer, the citizens, are taking 100% of the risk because it's being built by them, through their governments. And there's really no other country that is in the same situation as the United States in those terms as to whose responsibility it is and who takes the risk. Here it's private capital. And we have to be, two of the ways that this risk sharing has been accomplished is, number one, the loan guarantees from the federal government. So the utility is basically being guaranteed that if there is a default, that will be paid. The government isn't actually putting up any money, but they are kind of like co-signing the loan for the nuclear plant. The second way is that while you're building this $8 billion plant, in some states where electricity is regulated, it's possible for the regulators to put in a provision that allows the ratepayers to pay for the construction of the plant as it is built. So that the typical situation would be it takes 4 years to build a plant, at which time you've spent $8 billion. Now you have an $8 billion debt right at the beginning, before you even produce 1 megawatt of power. And then that has to be paid off. The better model is to pay that as you go while you're building the plant, so that you don't have an $8 billion debt, because you've already paid for it when you start running it. And that will mean that the electricity coming from that plant will be less expensive, because you're not having to carry this huge debt forward. And so those two mechanisms have been employed. In the Vogtle case, for example, in Georgia, there are loan guarantees for those 2 plants, and the ratepayers are paying at least part of the cost so that the debt load isn't so high when they begin operating the plant. And that way, the risk has been shared amongst a much larger number of people, including all the ratepayers and all the taxpayers in the United States, in order to share the risk of going forward with these new ventures. And it's been achieved.